I'm John Berman in for Jake Tapper today, and we do begin with the world lead. The United States' next mission in Iraq could begin any minute. The Pentagon tells CNN that some of the 300 U.S. military advisors ordered to Iraq by President Obama are in fact already there and are being drawn from personnel already in the country to protect the U.S. Embassy. Right now, their mission is to help the Iraqi military destroy ISIS on its own. The president has vowed that American troops will not go back into combat, but many military analysts, including some who saw action in places like Fallujah, say boots on the ground are boots on the ground. Meantime, the United Nations now says this terror siege has forced more than 1 million people to flee their homes in Iraq, but many who stayed behind are taking up arms against the Sunni extremists who are vowing to take Baghdad and now have one of Saddam Hussein's old bombed-out, dusty chemical weapons plants. We'll have much more on that a little later with the former chief U.S. weapons inspector. Meanwhile, senior international correspondent Nick Robertson has the latest from Baghdad.
In a nationally televised address, a top Shia cleric, Imam al-Safi, sought to tamp down sectarian tensions, calling on the government to ban all militias and clarifying an earlier call to arms.
This call was directed to everybody and not to one sect. It aimed to prepare to stand up to ISIS that has got the upper hand and strongest presence in many areas.
Meanwhile, supporters of ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, amped up their vicious sectarian message with a social media blitz featuring a YouTube video in English aimed at Westerners.
We have brothers from Bangladesh, from Iraq, from Cambodia, Australia, UK. Nothing has gathered us except to make Allah Azza wa Jalla with the highest.
On Iraq's ever-expanding battlefield, ISIS remains in control of vast parts of north and central Iraq and is fighting towards Baghdad. It is into this that US special forces are being sent back into Iraq, almost 3 years after US combat troops left. President Obama said as many as 300 special forces might be sent in an advisory role. They are set to assess the dangers ISIS poses and will be forming 2 joint operation centers with Iraqi troops.
Just like in any unfolding situation like this, like even in a disaster relief operation, one of the first things you do is you deploy assessment teams to go find out what the requirements are before you start flowing in your support. And that's what I think these first couple of teams will do.
So far, the fighting in Iraq this year has displaced more than 1 million people, the UN High Commissioner on Refugees says. We met the Red Cross chief for Iraq, who warned me where ISIS took control 6 months ago, the situation is dire and could be repeated in their new conquests in the north.
Fallujah has been blocked since quite some time, and the needs are only increasing.
Iraq is meanwhile looking to embattle Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki to form a more inclusive government. But Friday, there was no sign of any changes. Imam al-Safi told the faithful to be patient while a new government forms. And that, be patient while a new government is formed, is in fact a veiled threat. Nouri al-Maliki, a new government's to be formed. Your time is up, Maliki. It is time to go. It is the religious leaders in this country, and Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani, who this man was speaking for, is the most important. Millions of people hang on what he says. The importance of his Friday prayers, Friday sermons cannot be underestimated. This is a very powerful political message coming from this leader, saying that Nouri al-Maliki has not been able to bring the stability and meet the aspirations of the Iraqi people, has not been able to properly lead the country. It is time for change, and it should be happening now. A powerful message from this religious leader, John.
You know, a major statement from a man who really the entire population there, at least the Shia population, hangs on his every word. Nick Robertson in Baghdad, thank you so much. So with the first group of military advisors set to begin their work in Iraq soon, the question is just what exactly will they be doing? Joining me now is CNN military analyst and retired Lieutenant Colonel Rick Francona. He served as a U.S. Air Force intelligence officer during the Persian Gulf War, also served in northern Iraq with the CIA. Rick, thank you so much for being with us.
Sure.
You've been in this situation, so you can help me understand what's going on here. When these military personnel, these special forces, leave the U.S. Embassy, they go to the front lines, they show up, in what happens? You walk up to an Iraqi major and say, "Hi, I'm from America. I'm here to advise."
I'm here to help. No, there's an art to this. You have to go in there and let them know that you are there to help. But there's a way to do that without appearing to be arrogant. Like we're coming in here to tell you people who don't understand what you're doing how this is supposed to be done. We're the Americans. So follow what we, listen to what we say and do what we say. That doesn't work. You've got to get in there and, recruit them and let them know that you are there to help, but you want to work with them, not for them to work for you.
Do they actually want U.S. advice, or do they want U.S. missiles being fired from planes at these ISIS forces?
Actually, they want the latter, but they'll have to put up with the former to get that. They know that we're not going to commit weapons, we're not going to conduct airstrikes unless we feel that our needs are going to be met as well. And right now, we have to assess if that's going to actually be what the Iraqis need.
Well, that's the flip side. Are we there, the U.S., is the U.S. actually there to provide advice that the U.S. thinks will be taken, or are U.S. military personnel there to actually look at ISIS themselves and get a sense of what's going on?
Well, they're going to look at both, John. They're going to look first, they're going to look, their initial tasking, is my understanding from the Pentagon, is to assess the Iraqi army. Can they do this? What do they need? Can we help them? Is what we're going to do going to be enough to disrupt ISIS? And if that's not, then we have to come back and figure out what are we going to do, because the goal here is to get ISIS out of that country, and we're hoping that the Iraqi army can do it. So the first job is, can the Iraqis do this? If they can, what do they need? Then, and only then, should we be assessing ISIS.
And we say 300 U.S. military personnel headed there, but don't they need translators? Don't they need transport? Doesn't this indicate an operation that isn't insignificant?
Well, there'll be 300 Americans. All of that other support will probably be either contractors or local Iraqis that the Iraqi army will provide. So the 300 is actually just the U.S. Army, U.S. Air Force, U.S. Marine Corps, Navy personnel that are going to be there. And that 300 does not count the countless numbers of pilots that are overflying that country right now. So at any given moment, there are manned platforms over that country that are not being counted.
There's a phrase you hear tossed around sometimes, if you're not in the military, it doesn't necessarily mean much: rules of engagement. So you're one of these U.S. military personnel, they're advising the Iraqis. You get fired upon by ISIS, what do you do?
Well, I assume they're going to fire back and they'll be armed. But of course, the protection of these advisors will be the responsibility of the Iraqi army. But they're all going to have their own personal weapons, and the rules of engagement will allow them to respond, but only if they're shot at first. I know these are crazy rules.
Crazy. And again, when the president says no troops going back into combat, there's combat going all around them, so effectively they're in combat.
They're at risk. I mean, they're going to be pushed down as far as the brigade level. The brigade is the basic combat military unit of the Iraqi army. So if you're an advisor to a brigade headquarters, you're going to be out there where people are shooting at you.
Last question. Does this provide some kind of opportunity for U.S. involvement in Syria? The Syrian conflict's been very difficult for the U.S. to get involved in. But won't the U.S. follow ISIS if it sees them running across the border to Syria?
Well, that's a question I put to some of my colleagues at the Pentagon. They've decided not to answer that. They said right now they're going to focus on ISIS in Iraq, and Syria may be down the road. But they said that's a whole other political ballgame they don't want to talk about right now.
But if they can if the U.S. can kill some of the bad guys who've been fighting in Syria, if they can kill them or help kill them in the Iraqi desert, that's not a bad thing for the Syrian conflict.
Well, what we're also seeing is we're seeing the Syrian Air Force coming over into Iraq and bombing targets in Iraq. So you've got cooperation between the Iraqi government and the Syrian government killing people in Iraq. Now, we're going to get involved in that. We're going to put U.S. forces in the middle of this. This is a real problem.
And that's why it's so complicated, and that's why clearly the president has been so hesitant to get involved. Rick Francona, thank you so much for being with us. Appreciate seeing you. Coming up on The Lead, a terrorist organization has taken over another building in Iraq. Only this one houses the remnants of Saddam Hussein's chemical weapons. We'll ask the former U.S. weapons inspector in Iraq what these weapons were doing there in the first place. And then